First presentation this afternoon is on a topic that was hinted at by Kun Chawalit at the end of his presentation, and that's the role when he was talking about eco-products for building. But we're going to have a much more detailed and much more comprehensive look at the same topic from Dr. Brahmanand Mohanty, a very old friend and colleague of ours. Dr. Mohanty completed his master's at AIT and his PhD from the Institut National Polytechnique de Toulouse in France. And he's presently a visiting faculty member with AIT's energy field of study, and this is very much core to his expertise. So, Dr. Mohanty, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to all of you. It's always a difficult task to start the afternoon after a good lunch. Okay, I'll try to keep you awake. Especially, I'm going to start with the topic, what makes buildings green and sustainable. When I was asked to cover this topic, I asked myself, are buildings green and sustainable? Okay, that's a big question to ask. Which of the buildings here that you see is actually the greenest or the most sustainable? Okay. It's sort of the type of construction that we make today are all against sustainability. Okay. Anything that we construct today is not sustainable for various reasons. So today I will try to make it more relative. I'll talk about how much you can make it green and how much you can make it sustainable, because in the long run nothing is actually sustainable the way we construct today. You can see, I'll start with the first slide. Oh, keyboard is better, okay. Okay, I would like to go back a little bit, because today we have talked about futuristic buildings. We have looked at what could be the future of the buildings, tall buildings, etc. I'd like to go back to what we talk about. We are talking about how to go for net zero building today. There's a International Energy Agency under the OECD task force looking at how to go for net zero energy buildings by 2020 or 2025. And many countries are working on it. Here we have a net zero building. A building which didn't require any energy, we didn't have any energy. There was no electricity. And then gradually the building added components. We had what we call net positive energy building. Today we are talking about net positive energy building, and that already existed 2 centuries back. So we are sort of reinventing the wheel. Okay? We've just forgotten how we lived in the past. We're constructing new things, but we've just forgotten as to how we lived in the past and how sustainable things were and how they've changed over time. Why do you have to think about it today? We have seen the 20th century has taken us very far. Story of electricity is hardly 110 years old. We didn't have electricity before that. Today we cannot imagine life without electricity. And everything goes around it. We talk about building 300 meters, 400 meters, 500 meters. But just pause a while and think, what would happen in this building if there was no electricity? We depend on electricity for all aspects of our life, starting with mobile phones, computers, and any other things that you can think about, transportation, water supply, sanitations, etc. Today you can see the number of cities where the population is growing. So we do need to have more construction. Aspiration of people is also growing along with that. So we have to make a choice. We can't afford to have the urban sprawl. We need to go back to having denser cities like we had in the past. When we didn't have access to these fossil fuels, if you go back to the civilization, all our cities were very, very compact. They were around places where you could get resources. In terms of agriculture, in terms of water, most of the cities were located near the water. And this has changed because of having access to fossil fuel. we've started having urban sprawls. Now we got to think back as we see the population grows, as we go from 7 billion to, in the future, to 9 billion. And we see cities going, we have cities up to 35 to 37 million population. We got to have a different way of looking at it. We can't spend time 3 hours to commit to work and come back from work. These are some of the cities where you can see the amount of carbon emissions from these cities from different activities. And the blue part shows the contribution from buildings, transport and waste. Industry is the green part, and you can see kind of cities like Shanghai, Beijing, they're all the production house of the world. There's a lot of production which is going on, and from there you have emissions. But again, a major part come from the buildings, transport, etc. So the question is, how do you design more compact cities? And one of the things that we need to do is to go more high instead of more sprawl. So what are the benefits that you can think of? It's a question of between density versus the horizontal spread of the buildings. Definitely tall buildings provide you certain economy of scale, less materials required per unit of usable space. Okay? You have smaller space area of envelope per each floor area. Okay? You can share energy in a more efficient manner. We'll see it more in detail later on. And the buildings provide us today a potential to harvest solar and wind energy at a greater heights. As you go up, you can get better quality of airflow, better quality of lighting, exposed to the sun. So, the only thing is that the area is quite limited. We do have a few disadvantages of tall buildings. Very little interaction between the occupants and the envelope. Okay? And of course, as we go up, we have seen the amount of materials that we require. What we talked about, the embodied energy, the energy which goes into making a building, the structural form of the building is quite a lot. Now, how did the tall buildings come about? What made the change within hardly about 100 years? Okay. We go back to 1850s, elevators were designed first. Okay. And elevators allowed us to carry things up. Today you imagine, you go back to a palace, okay, and you think, how comfortable the kings were. They lived in a palace. But just imagine if they had to go up from one floor, they had to take the steps. They didn't have a lift. They didn't have water supply flowing in their bathroom. They didn't have electricity. So you can see a middle-class family today has a better access to all these resources. Okay? So lift is one of the things which made a big change, which allowed us to go up, and we could start seeing the first appearance of the tall buildings. The second one, of course, I mentioned about, is electricity. Again, the history is only about 110 years old. And the last one we joined is the Carrier's air conditioner. Okay? We all in the past lived, when I say we, our forefathers knew how to live with the nature. They didn't complain about 35 degrees and 80% humidity. But today we are in a condition that we always talk about comfort in terms of temperature and humidity. Okay? And Carrier brought about that change. So a heady combination of lifts, electricity, and air conditioner gave way to the tall buildings. Okay? Now, as a result, we have gone away from what we call the zero energy building to one of the first buildings that came up is the Empire State Building. Okay? And you can see the type of energies that are involved in terms of lighting, heating and cooling, and all this fan powers, pump powers, etc. And equipment. In that you also have the lift. So the lifts do consume a lot of energy. Okay? So if you have this breakup, you can see from a zero energy building by the beginning of 20th century, this is about 1935, okay, we already had buildings which consumed a lot of energy. Okay? And that's the trend which continued till the 70s, till we faced the first oil crisis. Okay? Now we need to have a look at it. How do you go back from these heavyweight stone? The first thing that happened is we went from stone structure to skyscrapers which are designed differently. Okay? There are light and fully glazed office buildings. And unfortunately what has happened is we are just aping the architecture which is perhaps better suitable in a temperate climate. You can't see any difference between a building which is constructed today in Manila or Mumbai or in Bangkok. They look the same as a building in Manhattan, for instance. Knowing fully well, we are in a climate where when you go out, people carry umbrella. They wear a hat, they wear sunglasses. But our buildings are just the opposite. Our buildings are designed today to absorb all the heat from outside. So we need to have a relook at the way we design things. This is how I would just like to show you. If all these lighting, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, electrical equipment, and other loads add up this big funnel that we need to fill in. A very conservative estimate of 250 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. Our buildings go up to, there are buildings which go up to 700, 800 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. I've just given you 250, adding up with lighting, ventilation, electrical equipment, etc. Now, we've come to a point now, suddenly we have realized everybody talks about climate change, global warming. Okay? And we also talk about the resource crunch. Where are you going to go get the resources from? Thailand, for example, depends on its electricity. 75% of its electricity comes from natural gas. Is that going to be forever? What are you going to do when we run out of natural gas? What are the alternatives that we have? So when you're constructing a building today which is going to be there for the next 50, 60, 80, 100 years, are we thinking about these options right from the beginning? Or are we just going to make buildings today which are going to be trapped in the system, that they are not going to be future-proof, and we'll have nice buildings, but there won't be enough energy to run them? So there is a reversing of the trend at present, where we talk about, I'll focus more on energy aspects, because when you talk about green buildings, energy is one of the major areas. Of course, we can also look at water and other materials, etc. Now, today you can see a building typically has a certain amount of, this is the energy content, and this is the life of the building. As embodied energy of the building is fixed. Once you construct it, the way you construct it, a certain amount of embodied energy goes in. Depending on the life of the building, you can have a building, same building with operating energy with low efficiency. And you can see as the building operates for longer and longer time, the operating energy becomes several times more than what we call the embodied energy. Because in tall buildings, we are concerned about how the embodied energy, the energy which goes into the construction, becomes important. But the operating energy becomes also important if you haven't designed it properly right from the beginning. With an average efficiency, you can see the operating energy. And with high efficiency, you can see we can go up to, let's say, 50 years, embodied energy will be equivalent to our operating energy. Of course, this will vary from location to location. It's very much site-specific, depending on the climatic conditions. So what is the emerging trend at present? How do you make the buildings more sustainable, more green, in the sense that how do you start reducing the resource requirements of the building from components perspective as well as from the systems perspective? Okay. So when we talk about operating energy, we're talking about how we demand energy for different activities, whether it is for lighting, for air conditioning, or for lifts, etc. Okay. And demand side measures, we can look at how we can go for what we call bioclimatic architecture or the passive architecture. The way buildings were designed in the past. We just have to go back and learn from what we did in the past, the past architecture, and marry it with the new materials, new technology that we have. Then we can come up with solutions which are far better than what we had in the past. At the same time, we keep our ancient knowledge with us. Next is energy efficiency and management, and that's where all the technology, new devices, new solutions that have come up can be utilized in the best possible manner. I talked about the lift, electricity, or air conditioner. Supply side measures, we can't only depend on fossil fuels. We start looking at alternative energies, and particularly renewables, or on-site generation, because that's something where we produce, we use it there, we become much more conscious, and our buildings act very quickly with the changes of the natural energies that we can find everywhere. The second part, I talked about the embodied energy. Okay. In embodied energy, you've heard about it. I will not repeat too much. There have been several speakers who have already talked about it. How do you go for innovative structural systems by which you can reduce the embodied energy in the materials? And we have new materials like nano, smart materials and green technology which have come up. And some of our speakers have already talked about it in the morning. I go back to the same funnel that I talked about, the same cone I talked about. We start with 250 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. How do you make it more energy efficient? How do you reduce the energy requirement? How do you make it more sustainable? Where do you start from? The first point to start is, obviously, look at the top of it by bringing bioclimatic architecture. I'll go through it in a little bit more detail in a minute. The moment we go for bioclimatic architecture, if the building is properly designed right from the beginning, we've already reduced from 250 kilowatt hour to 175 kilowatt hour per meter square per year before the building has been constructed. This is something that we need to keep in mind. How often you go to architectural firms, they say, sorry, the designs are already over, we can't do anything about it. And this is where you have a huge scope right from the beginning. If you look at it properly, bring in the bioclimatic architecture, and doesn't necessarily require more investment. It requires a little bit more time. And there are many new models, simulation models. Due to the limited time, I'm not going into the details, but you have today software which can simulate and tell you in what way, how much can be your savings by designing buildings in a different way. Then we bring in efficiency, and we have many, many solutions. Again, I'll talk about it. By the time you can see, from 250 kilowatt hour per meter square per year, we have brought it down to only 100 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. Then it becomes more interesting to think about alternative sources of energy. How do you use renewable energy? We're down to only 50 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. This can happen with the present context. We are not talking about future prices. We're talking about today, the energy prices which are prevailing. It is possible for you to go to a low energy building by in building in this type of solutions. And what is interesting is that when you start from the top with bioclimatic architecture, you reduce without practically any investment. Then you go into efficiency. People talk about efficiency costing more, but we forget that by the time we bring in efficiency, our demands have reduced. So we can go for smaller machines, smaller devices, which are more efficient and not necessarily spending more money. And the money that is saved in operating this building will take care of the requirement of renewable energy. And government policies are there. For example, in Thailand, you have an adder, which allows people to put up solar on top of a rooftop. And solar can serve two purposes. If you design it right from the beginning, it becomes part of your building structure. It's not something as an add-on, and it can reduce your cost to a certain extent. So we look at how to achieve this, reducing the cone to the extent possible with the existing technology, etc. I start with the bioclimatic architecture. You can divide into two parts. The passive part, there are no moving part. How do you design with the right orientation of the building? Where should be the location of the different activities in the building according to where the sun rises and where the sun sets? Solar protection, daylighting. When you talk about building envelope itself, how do you go for natural ventilation? It is possible. As you go high-rise, the quality of air improves, it becomes cooler, and you have more ventilation. We have seen how the air movements change at heights. Window-to-wall area ratio. Is it necessary for us to have fully glazed facades? Can we have a right proportion by which we have enough light coming in so that people don't feel claustrophobic at the same time? You have daylighting, you're benefiting from the daylighting. Envelope insulation and high-performance glazing where it's required, how you go for new type of glazing that are coming in by which you can allow the light to come in but cut off the heat. Then comes the energy efficiency part. Again, I've divided into lighting, HVAC, and other equipment. Each of them, you have solutions today. Starting with lighting, we can see it's possible for you to divide the demand by 5 times just by going from halogen to light-emitting diodes, or division by 5 times. With the same services, you can divide the energy demand 5 times. Similarly, we have solutions for air conditioning as well as other equipment. Okay. Reflectors, sensor-based lighting control. When people are not there, in many places lights are on. How do you switch it off? How do you have compensated daylighting compensation basis by which when the daylight comes in, automatically lights reduce, and when there is not enough light, the lights come on, artificial lights come on. HVAC, again, we have seen how the air conditioning technology has improved over the years. We have new solutions, for example, what we call radiant heating and cooling. cooling by air is very energy intensive. We can divide into two parts. We can cool it by surface cooling, for example, radiant cooling of what we call chill beams or cool floors. For example, the airport of Bangkok, Suvarnabhumi airport of Bangkok, much of the cooling is done by floor cooling, by keeping the floor cool, by which you have the radiant effect. Human body can radiate. Our body temperature is 37 degrees. We are able to radiate a lot of heat to the surrounding, by which we make ourselves comfortable. And we have demand control ventilation, by which we can adjust according to the requirement, how much amount of ventilation is required in terms of CO2 in the room, by which we can have sensors today, by which we can control the amount of ventilation that is required depending on the number of people in a room. And finally, other equipment. I mentioned about new types of equipment by which you can have variable speed drives, etc., by which you can reduce further. Next, we can look at energy recovery. A chiller is operating to take the heat out from the room and throw it out. It's possible to have chiller heat recovery. Instead of throwing it out, how do you recover that to take care of the heating requirement of the building, whether it's for bathing and other purposes? Exhaust air heat recovery. The room has to reject certain amount of air to bring in fresh air, to maintain the CO2 level, to maintain the quality of air. How do you do it in a more intelligent manner by which you can have heat recovery system? You have condensation heat recovery. If you have a boiler operating, how do you optimize it? Or generator heat recovery, where you have a local generation of energy on site. Well, renewable energy, we can think about solar thermal, photovoltaics, wind, geothermal. There are places where we can go down on the earth by which the earth temperature remains constant, irrespective of the ambient temperature variations. How do you tap with that? We can use it for heat pump or cooling systems by which we can save energy by 20 to 25%. Last comes in the generation part. As I mentioned, if the electricity is generated far away, by the time it comes to the site where we use it, there are lots of losses in the process. Today, it's possible for you, for example, a power plant which is put far away, due to the laws of thermodynamics, the efficiency is typically about 40 to 50%. Half of it is lost. But if you put it near the building where the users are, it's possible to recover the energy up to 80, 85%, by which you can improve the efficiency and reduce the consumption to great extent. We have solutions like fuel cells. We're talking about cogeneration, trigeneration. I mentioned to you about Suvarnabhumi Airport. They use trigeneration. They produce electricity, they recover the heat. With the heat, they produce cooling, and the cooling is taking care of all the air conditioning, so they don't need to have compression air cooling system. And finally, the district energy network, by which each building need not have the system, so you can have a centralized system near the buildings and providing in a radius of 1, 2, 3, 5 kilometers. I'll just give you very quickly a few examples of passive design features. Okay? You can see here, this is the building again in a climate where it's not very suitable, how they have used louvers, horizontal louvers, to cut off the heat. Especially if you know your building is facing the east or the west, where the sun rises and the sun sets, the amount of energy that you get in most of the places, we just put a curtain and sit behind. The heat comes into the building, and we have to resort to artificial lighting. How do you go for innovative types of louvers by which you can protect the building from the direct sun? Okay? And how do you control by automatic detection the equipment to increase or the decreasing of the solar shading? Depending on the sky conditions, this building can adjust automatically. Okay? Similarly, how do you reduce the air infiltration by sealing the building well so that you can minimize the heating requirement? Another example, you can see as the buildings become taller, okay, there is more chances of you to use these type of options, okay, because tall buildings have less constraints in terms of the shape of the land plot. If they're small buildings, you always have a constant because your neighbor is shading, or you don't have the air passages. As the building go up, you have more space, and you have more flexibility to make use of solar radiation or the cooling systems. Okay? And you can see the thermal and visual performances can be improved quite a lot by just orienting the building properly so that you can maximize the view, maximize the solar lighting, daylighting as much as possible by following the sun path in the sky. Today we have, this is one of the famous buildings of Norman Foster's design, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank of Commerce, how they've used ventilated double screen facades by which you allow the air movements between double screen, okay, by which you can provide a lot of cooling the heat does not go into the building, because that acts like a buffer both in summer months or winter months. If it's a cold climate, you can also do the same thing by having a buffer in winter months. Okay? So you can, the passive thermal effect can be improved quite a lot. Whenever it's required, you can have open windows, and you don't have the risk of falling off because you have a double facade, by which people can keep the windows open and make best use of the stack effect of air movement going up. Thank you. Okay, you have got what we call this. You can see a bioclimatic skyscraper. This is in UK. You can see how they have made use of the solar on top of the building. Okay, this is the Flower Tower in Sutton. This coming back to the tropical climate. Again, many of you will be familiar with the this particular building, which is in Malaysia, okay, where they have looked at how to design a building to make best use of the local climatic conditions with a bioclimatic architecture, where the form of the building, okay, very often architects are more worried about the form, but how to combine the form with the performance. Okay? The good marriage between the form and the performance can happen only when you have a good understanding of where the building is going to be constructed, the form of the building, the plants and terraces. This particular building, you don't have to have only green at the earth level, at the ground level. You can also create the green effect, by which psychologically people already feel better, and you can have a better environment for people to live up there. Orientation, and finally glazing and shading. These features have allowed this building to reduce its energy demand by more than 50%. Okay, and you can see some more features. I will not go into the details. This is the final product which came out of it. Okay, and well, this was the time when they still hadn't added the solar panels, which came later on this building. And you can see the various types of features which went in what I talked about in the beginning to bring down the size of the cone to a great extent by architecture, energy efficient solutions, etc. This is again an integrated strategy to combine lighting and cooling together. You can see here again they're using systems by which you can have an air cooling system combined with the lighting in a building, and there is a flow cooling at the same time. In this case, it can be cooled in summer months, and you can have heating in winter months. They use what I talked about, the chill beam system. By chill beam, we reduce the amount of air that is required, the velocity of air which is required, by which we can reduce the power of fans and blowers. Wind, again, I have mixed feeling about these. Okay, putting up this type of structure, again, the amount of energy which goes into the building structure itself is quite important. But architects have shown that it's possible to make use of the effect of wind. You can see as you go up to higher and higher level, the wind spills improve, and the amount of energy that you can get out at a higher level is not a linear function, but a cubic function of the velocity of air at a higher level. The computer is programmed to stop when I have reached my time. Oh, it moved. It says many things. All right. Well, this is again a very interesting architecture of a building in Shanghai. A tall building. They looked at similar type of concept that I talk about. Okay, Pearl River Tower. They looked at first reduction, what I mentioned about earlier, through efficiencies and some of the architectural options. Reclamation, basically recovery. They looked into passive absorption as much as possible. I talked about this solar and other passive systems. And finally, they went to generation. They have also gone into similar type of things that I mentioned earlier. Okay. I've talked about many things where if you're going to make a new building, what can you do about it? But that doesn't mean there is nothing much for us to do in existing buildings. This is a good example of, I mentioned earlier about the Empire State Building. Okay. The building owners decided a few years back to retrofit the building with the existing facades, how they could reduce the load to a certain extent, again bring in efficient technology, and with good control, they could bring down the consumption. Okay. The savings, okay, you can see starting with glazing, changing the glazing, insulation of the building in certain areas, okay, daylighting as much as possible, and good control system so that they know the behavioral of people by which automatically they will switch off the things which are not required. And you can see the types of savings they could achieve in different areas to bring down the consumption, energy savings in different areas. Huge investment, but what is interesting is you can see the reduction of energy bill by 38%, which is $4.4 million US. Payback period of the investment would be within 3 to 5 years. Looking at the life of the building, this is a good way to retrofit by which you can continue to use the building for a long time. So many of the buildings have a huge potential to reduce their consumption just by going for retrofitting, and some of the solutions can be done. Obviously, you cannot change the orientation of the building, and yet you can bring in some other measures by which you can bring in efficiency as the technology improves, etc. And lastly, I would like to conclude by this particular building. If you allow, Mr. Chair, just 2 minutes. I have a short video which will capture better than what I can say. Is there a sound here? We'll put the volume of the speaker. Yeah. This one, okay. Still myself. The best part is this is an initiative of the government of Malaysia, the Energy Commission. Okay? The government leads the way by which the government sets up the building and shows that it's possible and it's cost effective, so that the message goes out to the private sector as to how they can construct. So the main message I would like to pass is, when you are looking at the structure, don't forget about these aspects right from the beginning. It's always harder and more expensive to do retrofitting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Any questions from the floor? I think we can take one. I think you've covered everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please give a final round of applause.